5 brain habits that improve learning. There is a particular kind of frustration that almost no one talks about honestly. You sit down to learn something. Maybe it is a skill you genuinely want, something that matters to you. You read the same paragraph 3 times. You watch the video, take the notes, highlight the page. And then, a week later, almost none of it is there. Not because you were distracted, not because you did not care. You cared quite a lot, actually. And that is exactly what makes it so quietly defeating. Most people, when this happens, arrive at the same conclusion. They decide something is wrong with them. Their memory is poor. Their focus is broken. They are simply not the kind of person who learns easily. They have heard this story about themselves long enough that it has started to feel like a fact. But here's what's rarely said out loud. The problem is almost never the person. It is almost always the method. And more specifically, it is the gap between how most people were taught to learn and how the brain actually learns. What tends to get labeled as a short attention span or laziness or poor retention is often something else entirely. It's a nervous system that was handed the wrong tools and never shown what the right ones feel like. So let us talk about what is actually happening inside the brain when learning sticks, and why 5 specific habits, each grounded in neuroscience, quietly change everything. The first has to do with something called the spacing effect. When you learn something once and then revisit it after a delay, your brain treats the second encounter as meaningful. Neuroscientist and memory researcher Hermann Ebbinghaus mapped this over a century ago, and what he found was that forgetting is not a failure, it's actually a trigger. The slight struggle of trying to remember something you are on the verge of forgetting signals to the brain this information is being called upon again, so it is worth retaining more deeply. Spacing your learning out over time, even in small doses, is not a passive strategy. It's a way of telling your memory system that something is recurring and therefore worth keeping. The brain does not preserve everything. It preserves what it perceives as frequently needed. The second habit involves what researchers call retrieval practice. There's a long-held assumption that rereading and reviewing are how you commit something to memory. But cognitive psychologist Henry Roediger showed in a landmark study that the act of actively retrieving information, trying to recall it rather than just re-exposing yourself to it, dramatically outperforms passive review. What is happening neurologically is elegant. Every time you retrieve a memory, you are not just accessing it, you are rebuilding it. The neural pathway gets reconstructed, slightly stronger each time, slightly more resistant to decay. Closed-book recall, even when it feels uncertain or incomplete, is doing more work than reading the highlighted page ever could. The third is something you have probably experienced without having a name for it. It's called interleaving. Most learning environments encourage blocked practice, finishing one topic completely before moving on to the next. It feels productive because progress is visible and linear. But researchers Robert Bjork and Elizabeth Bjork found something counterintuitive. Mixing up topics and problem types, even within a single study session, produces slower apparent progress in the moment, but significantly better retention and transfer over time. The brain, when forced to repeatedly identify which approach applies to which problem, builds something richer than simple familiarity. It builds a kind of flexible recognition, the ability to use what you know in contexts you have never encountered before. The feeling of confusion during interleaved practice is not a sign that something is going wrong, it's a sign that something deeper is being built. The fourth habit connects to the body in a way that tends to surprise people. Sleep is not a passive recovery period for the brain, it's an active one. During slow-wave and REM sleep, the brain replays memories, consolidates new information into long-term storage, and prunes the connections that are not being reinforced. Neuroscientist Matthew Walker's research demonstrated that even a short nap after learning can measurably improve retention, while studying late and cutting sleep does the reverse. What this means practically is that the hours after learning, and particularly the night following it, are not separate from the learning itself. They are the part where the brain does its most important work. You do not learn and then sleep. The sleep is where learning completes itself. The fifth habit is the one most people resist because it feels like it shouldn't be enjoyable and productive at the same time. It's the practice of explaining what you have learned in your own words, as though you are teaching someone who knows nothing about it. Psychologist Frank Laubach, and later Feynman in his own way, both arrived at the same insight. The gaps in your understanding only become visible when you try to explain. As long as you are reading or watching, you can mistake recognition for comprehension. But the moment you try to generate an explanation, the places where your understanding is thin become impossible to ignore. And crucially, the process of constructing the explanation is itself a form of encoding. The brain is not just revealing what it knows, it's organizing it, connecting it, giving it structure that makes it retrievable later. None of these 5 habits are about working harder. They are about working in alignment with what the brain is actually designed to do. And this distinction matters enormously because most people who struggle to learn do not lack effort. They often have an excess of it, applied in directions the brain cannot use. There's also something worth naming about the environment in which many of these habits failed to develop. Traditional education rewards the appearance of learning. Test scores, performance under pressure, the ability to reproduce information quickly within a narrow window of time. These are real skills, but they are not the same as durable understanding, and for many people, years of schooling quietly reinforced habits that work in the short term and dissolve almost immediately afterward. The nervous system adapted to that environment. It learned to perform rather than to retain. That is not a character flaw, it's an entirely rational response to the conditions that were present. Different people will also find different combinations of these habits more natural than others. Someone with a more structured approach might take to spaced repetition immediately. Someone more narrative-driven might find the teach-back method immediately compelling. There is no single correct sequence here, and no version of this that is more intellectually serious than another. The brain is not uniform, neither is the way it responds to being met correctly. Here's the counterintuitive part that tends to land quietly but lingers. The habits that feel least like learning, the ones that feel effortful, uncertain, even uncomfortable, are often precisely the ones that work best. The smoothness of rereading gives the impression of progress. The roughness of retrieval practice, the fumbling for a word you almost remember, feels like failure. But that roughness is the mechanism. The brain treats difficulty as a signal for investment. Ease in learning often means nothing new is being built. What this means for you is that you do not need to overhaul everything at once. It means that the gap between what you have absorbed and what you have retained is not a personal deficiency, it's a mechanical one. The brain operates on specific conditions, and when those conditions are met, learning happens in a way that feels almost surprisingly natural, not easy but solid, the kind of understanding that is still there 6 months later when you need it. You are not someone who cannot learn. You are someone who may not yet have been shown how the brain prefers to be taught. If any of this felt familiar, not just intellectually, but in some quieter, more personal way, there is likely more worth exploring about how your mind works, how it takes in information, what it responds to, and why it behaves the way it does under pressure. That territory is deeper and more interesting than it might first appear.